This is the skin of a killer Bella.
At the age of 10, my friend described to me this new movie that she had just seen, not knowing that by doing that, she was altering the course of my life. The movie was called Twilight, and the way that she described it, it hit at all of my most basic primal preteen interests: teen, high school, romance. That's all I needed to hear. But the twist was that there were vampires. And I wasn't really familiar with seeing vampires much on screen up until that point. But it sounded so interesting that this regular 17-year-old high school girl falls in love with this really mysterious, dreamy, handsome boy who turns out to be a century-old vampire. But their love is almost forbidden because he is constantly fighting the desire to suck her blood. I just thought that sounded so interesting. I thought that was insane. So I checked it out and I was absolutely enchanted. Immediately, I got my hands on the books and I read through all of them. And you bet, as all of the rest of the movies came out for the next few years, I was there seeing them on opening weekend. Although I was absolutely, without a doubt, obsessed with the world of Twilight, I still had enough awareness to recognize that there are many aspects of it that are fundamentally very cringy and just so bad. But that was part of the fun. That was largely part of its charm, that it's also something that you can just really laugh and cringe at. What I didn't have enough awareness about, though, were some of its more hidden, sinister themes. I don't mean just the monster aspect of the vampire, the sucking blood or anything like that. I mean that there was something about being in the world of Twilight that made me wish deep down that I was like them, that I was different than me. I wish I had the kind of beauty that the characters had that was so emphasized, over and over again. She just talks about the pale skin all the time. I wished that I could be part of the same cultural magical world of the poised Cullens. Some people might be like, okay, you're being so sensitive. What are you talking about? It's just a fun, harmless little story. But the thing about stories, though, is just in all areas of life, they have a particular view of the world. They have a certain politic, and that worldview and that politic is shaped by the worldview of the people who write them. It's in the way they create and drive the plot, the way they write and develop the characters, how they define the nature of the story's conflict, and the way that they write the dialogue. It's all in there. If someone has really great politics, a good, well-rounded, empathetic worldview, that will reflect in their writing and their stories. But poor politics makes for poor writing and stories most of the time. And this matters because audiences who engage with these stories absorb all of those subliminal messages, most often without questioning them. That in turn can affect their own politic and their own political development and their own worldview and their relationships with those kinds of ideas in real life, especially really young audiences, which is or was Twilight's main demographic. When we see and engage with the real life paralleled scenarios of these kinds of stories, we may often find ourselves on the wrong side of them because of how these stories have trained us to think. I think Twilight is the perfect example of this, and I'm gonna yap to you about it. Stephenie Meyer's conception of the vampire folktale is a really interesting one. She took the age-old myth about these undead, often demonic-like and terrifying creatures, and made vampirism a form kind of like transhumanism in a way. The Twilight vampire is stronger, faster, more intelligent, and a more beautiful, immortal version of a human. They are described as having these perfect, beautiful bodies. They are immune to sickness. Oftentimes, they have superpower-like special abilities, such as mind reading and precognition. When one becomes a vampire, they basically become a new and improved version of their human mortal self. And unlike past conceptions of vampirism, this one overwhelmingly throughout the story is seen as something to really desire being. It more closely resembles the state of immortality that's associated with things like the Fountain of Youth versus just an undead demonic monster. So much so, the character of Dr. Carlisle Cullen, the head of the Cullen Coven, first formed the Cullen family over a period of years where he found each one of them dying and transformed them into vampires. That was the only way he could save their lives, by making them immortal. This act in the story is overall presented as a good thing, though there is some debate and pushback from various characters about the idea of vampirism, whether it damns your soul and immortality as a whole, whether it really is a good thing, whether or not like humanity is better, whether they miss their humanity. But our protagonist, Bella, our heroine, it's all she wants. She's terrified of the concept of aging. She wants to become a vampire so bad. She wants to become immortal and stay young forever. And she does in the end. It's written as like a happy ending that she becomes that and gets what she wants. So overall, like the story paints vampiric immortality as a desirable thing. Anyways, beyond all that, the thing is, Meyer took this concept of the transhuman vampire, if you want to call it, and explored it in a really weird way. You see, Meyer is Mormon, which most people in the fandom know at this point, and that matters like a lot. As a child, me, who was raised Christian, when I was reading the books, I could not help but think that a lot of these characteristics Meyer was giving these immortal vampires sounded a lot like what the church teaches about the transformation that saved humans will undergo when they reach heaven and like are resurrected. And while the details of the order of events at the end of the world and Christ's second coming and when exactly it is humans will go to heaven differ between different sects and denominations in Christianity and Mormonism, and whether Mormons are even considered Christian is an ongoing debate. Depending on who you ask, different topic for a different day. There's generally a unified belief amongst all the groups that eventually when humans reach heaven, they will get new, immortal, beautiful bodies, and they will be perfect in every regard. So when I found out that Stephenie Meyer was Mormon, I thought that there's no way that that's just a coincidence. She had to at least been somewhat inspired by Mormon doctrine ideas. It's almost like this version of vampirism is an allegory for the idea of salvation. And I mean, that's already the way Carlisle uses it. Like he uses it to save people from dying, just like salvation is saving people from the wages of sin, which is death. But there's another aspect to her take on vampirism that is weird, and it's not included in the movie adaptations. It's really only in the books, but it's a very major thing, and it's that all vampires have pale white skin. Every single one of them. Like, all of them are white. In the Twilight Illustrated Guide, Stephenie Meyer explicitly talks about how this was an intentional choice of hers. She explains that the vampire venom that transforms a human into a vampire when they are bitten lightens the pigment of one's skin. It gets rid of all the melanin as part of what she calls the beautification process. So regardless of what someone's race or ethnicity was as a human, their skin turns very pale white, always. She was very, very insistent on this, so much so that she was very resistant to diverse casting in the films, and it was actually the choice of the directors to cast all, like, the vampires of color that we see. But, of course, they're all still just very minor characters. Catherine Hardwicke, it's Hardwicke, sorry, I mispronounced that. The director of the first movie explains all of this. Meyer had not really written it that way. So she probably just didn't see the world that way, said Hardwicke. And I was like, oh my God, I want the vampires. I want them all. Alice, I want her to be Japanese. I had all of these ideas, and she just couldn't accept the Cullens to be more diverse because she had really seen them in her mind. She knew who each character was representing in a way, a personal friend or relative or something. She said, I wrote that they had this pale, glistening skin. So all we could get in the vampire diversity department in the first film was Laurent, an antagonist, played by Kenyan-born actor Eddie Githegi. Hardwick says, the only reason that came through was he was described as having olive skin. And I said, there are black olives out there. Hardwick said, then she was open to the students in Bella's peer group being other ethnicities, so we got Christian Serratos and Justin Schoen. So we were able to open it up a little bit. They had to beg Stephanie Meyer for scraps, small diversity scraps. And that's exactly what she gave us. A minor antagonist and 2 very minor characters no one really cares about that much. Other vampires in the story who were written to have been POC in their human lives are portrayed extremely racistly. They're described as feral and uncivilized, in stark contrast to their white vampire counterparts. Racism is an accurate way to describe this insistence and choice, but when you also consider that she's Mormon, it makes even more sense in an even more sinister way. Remember how I said that Meyer's take on vampirism seems eerily a lot like an allegory for salvation in the biblical tradition? Well, there is a very insidious belief that has surrounded salvation as it pertains to race and the history of the Western Christian Church as a whole, but also more specifically to the development of the Mormon doctrine. And this belief is slyly reflected in this Twilight vampire salvation allegory. And that belief is the curse of Ham and the curse of Cain. The curse of Ham and the curse of Cain originate from the biblical stories of the 2 characters, Ham and Cain, both from the book of Genesis. Ham comes around the time of Noah in Genesis. He is one of 3 sons of Noah who is mentioned. Now, these 3 sons are believed in the narrative to be from whom all humans currently now on Earth are descended from. They are the 3 who started to repopulate the Earth with their wives after the great worldwide flood wiped out almost all of humanity, except for them. The story of Ham's curse goes, one night, Ham finds Noah drunk and naked in his tent. Verse 22, Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father's nakedness and told his 2 brothers who were outside. Shem and Japheth took the garment and placed it on their shoulders. Then they walked in backwards and covered up their father's nakedness. Their faces were turned the other way, so they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah finds out what happened, he curses Ham's son, Canaan, saying that he shall be, quote, a servant of servants. There are obviously no racial terms used in the Bible to describe any of these characters because our modern concept of race obviously didn't exist then. However, in recent centuries, as many scholars of Abrahamic traditions continued to interpret these stories in a variety of ways, and especially with the dawn of the Atlantic slave trade and modern colonization, Ham came to be widely portrayed as black, as a way to link blackness and the idea of perpetual servitude in order to fully lock in an idea of a racial hierarchy to justify the slavery and subjugation of black people and solidify the conception of the newly created black race. Dating back to around the 15th century is when we first start seeing leaders citing the passage as the justification for the enslavement of all African people. The idea was that all black Africans descended from Ham, and that curse of servitude was placed on his son Canaan, meaning that black people were condemned to slavery, thus serving as a religious justification for the Atlantic slave trade. Black people were predestined to be slaves, as they taught, mandated by God as the quote-unquote slave race. Many even took this idea a step further, arguing that it was in the best interest of Africans to be slaves because it would hasten their conversion and salvation, quote, redeeming and purifying their souls for Judgment Day. The historian Katie Cannon describes the process. Quote, drunk with power and driven by grand delusions, government officials and officers of slave trading companies succumbed to the lies and manipulations that their sole salvation depended on the ceaseless replication of systemic violence. In the American colonies especially, the curse of Ham was the main ideological justification for slavery. All the way through to the Civil War, Southern pastors proclaimed from their pulpits with ferocity and rage Noah's condemnation of Canaan and how it condemned all Africans to slavery. Benjamin P. Palmer, pastor of the First Presbyterian Church in New Orleans and Mississippi's preeminent clergyman during the Civil War, raged in sermon after sermon that Noah's curse was a prophetic blueprint of the destinies of the races. While the white descendants of Shem and Japheth, Noah's elder sons, would flourish and succeed, Palmer asserted that upon Ham was produced the doom of perpetual servitude. So now, that's a brief history of the curse of Ham. Now let's move on to the curse of Cain. Cain is the son of Adam and Eve. After he kills his brother, Abel, out of jealousy, God curses him by banishing him to a land far away. Cain responds, verse 13, "My punishment is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." But the Lord said to him, "Not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over." Then the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. And so what is that mark exactly? The truth is nobody knows for sure. But the Mormons especially thought that they had an idea. And yes, before you guess, it has to do with Black people. The Pearl of Great Price, originally published in 1851, is part of the canonical standard works of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. In it, the descendant of Cain is described as being black, implying that said mark is that of dark skin. Church President Brigham Young, the second president of the Mormon Church, stated, "What is the mark? You will see it on every countenance of every African you ever did see." He even once taught that the devil was black. But it was Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, that translated both Cain and Ham as being the descendants of Black people. In his translation, Smith wrote, "Canaan shall be his servant, and a veil of darkness shall cover him, that he shall be known among all men." He also wrote, quote, "There was a blackness come upon all the children of Canaan, and the seed of Cain were black, and had not place among them." Wilford Woodruff, president of the church from 1889 to 1898, also affirmed this idea of Cain having this mark of blackness, and that lineage continuing on through Ham and his son Canaan. Quote, "What was that mark? It was a mark of blackness. That mark rested upon Cain and descended upon his posterity from that time until the present. Today there are millions of the descendants of Cain through the lineage of Ham in the world, and that mark of darkness still rests upon them." A lot of hoops to jump through to claim that Black people have dark skin because God marked them and then later on cursed them to be the lowest of servants. Yet even more hoops appear when examining Twilight's treatment of indigenous peoples. It's not just Black people who were demonized by this terrible ideology. Indigenous and Native Americans were as well. Wilford Woodruff drew a parallel from Cain's mark of blackness to modern Native Americans' curse of redness, he called it. He continues his statement, quote, "The Lamanites," that's what they called them, "on this continent, the continent of North America, suffered a similar experience. They thirsted for blood, and they painted themselves red, and the Lord put a curse of redness upon them. Hundreds of years have passed since then, but wherever you meet the Lamanites today, you see that mark upon them." Brigham Young, who again was the second president of the church, arranged the idea of these cursed lineages into a 3-tier classification. Yeah, they were getting very pseudoscientific with it. The Lamanites, who were indigenous Americans, or what they referred to as quote-unquote Indians, were at the top. They were cursed because, quote, their fathers had violated the order of God, which was formally among them. So they are not descendants of Ham and Cain, but God did at some point curse them, placing a mark of redness on their skin because they had strayed away from living righteously. But they're not as bad as Black people who are at the lowest tier. They can be redeemed in sometime in the foreseeable future, but Black people according to them, could not be, not until the end of the world during, the resurrection and the second coming of Jesus, when everybody goes to heaven. Black people were the first cursed, and, quote, they will be the last from whom the curse will be removed. When all the other children of Adam have had the privilege of receiving the priesthood and of coming into the kingdom of God and being redeemed from the four quarters of the earth and have received the resurrection from the dead, then it will be time enough to remove the curse of Cain and his posterity. A key part of these cursed races being redeemed in their respective times is that when it happens, when they are finally saved from their wickedness, their skin will turn white. I'm not kidding. That's what they believed would happen. Quote, and the gospel of Jesus Christ shall be declared among them, and their scale of darkness shall begin to fall from their eyes, and many generations shall not pass away among them, save they shall be white and delightsome people. 2 Nephi 30:5-6 from the Book of Mormon. So again, just to clarify one more time, because this might be confusing since it's freaking insane. For Black people, it's not until the very end, at the end of the world, that this will happen. But for Native Americans, this said transformation will happen sometime in the foreseeable future, here in this world, I guess. It's a little bit unclear. So what would that look like? It looks like following the church teaching as well as assimilating and conforming, which will eventually lead to their skin becoming whiter. And while the details may be a bit more complicated than that because there were mixed ideas throughout the church, it was like kind of an ongoing debate that in essence was the end goal. It seems a lot of Mormons in the church thought of this whitening amongst indigenous people specifically to be more of a miraculous, gradual thing. The more they assimilated and practiced the faith, the more like their skin would lighten over time. In 1953, president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles stated, quote, after the people again forgot the Lord, the dark skin returned. When the Lamanites fully repent and sincerely receive the gospel, the Lord has promised to remove the dark skin. Perhaps there are some Lamanites today who are losing the dark pigment. Many of the members of the church among the Catawba Indians of the South could readily pass as of the white race. Also in other parts of the South. This apostle's name was Spencer Kimball. He specifically suggested that the skin lightening was a result of the care, feeding, and education given to Native American children in home placement programs. Specifically here, he is referring to the program he helped spearhead, the ISPP, or Indian Student Placement Program. In 1954, the church started the ISPP, which placed Native children into white church members' homes to educate and assimilate them into their way of life. An estimated 50,000 Native American children participated in this program. On the church's website today, you can find a whole page that talks about the history of this program. It says, the ISPP was founded in the wake of World War II, which brought many American Indians into contact with the dominant culture and convinced many Native leaders and parents of the value of Euro-American education. In 1946, an estimated 2/3 of the Navajo population, from which a significant percentage of ISPP participants came, had received no formal education. Federal Indian schools were underfunded and were often geographically inaccessible to a lot of Native children. Parents and tribal officials during the post-war era, looking for ways to alleviate poverty in their communities, were therefore open to new educational opportunities for the rising generation. Of course, raising funding and providing resources for these indigenous communities experiencing poverty as a result of the centuries of genocide and violence committed against them, and letting them lead out their education in their own culture isn't the way the church wants to help. Nope. Instead, the church needs to teach these savages their way. And that means coercing them to hand over their children and forcing them to follow Euro-American values and ways of life. Otherwise, how will they be saved so that their skin loses its pigment and turns white? The page goes on to say that although the program originally started hosting mainly Navajo children, as it expanded in the 1960s, Native American students from many tribal nations throughout the United States and even Canada were placed in Latter-day Saint homes throughout the North American West. The page also claims that the program produced mixed results. By that, they mean some children assimilated well and went on to graduate and go to college while others didn't. It claims that those that went on to graduate often also maintained a high degree of commitment to the church, participating in their congregation, paying tithe, adhering to the word of wisdom, and marrying in the temple. The page also goes on to mention that many natives found that the program's privileging of Western values separated them from their native family and culture. It phrases this as the negative part of the mixed results. But I think framing this whole impact as having mixed results is incredibly misleading and sanitizing what this actually was. I don't concede to the idea that Native children successfully assimilating here in this context and going on to be loyal members of the church is a positive thing. I don't concede to the idea that this is them doing well, because what they're assimilating to here is white supremacy. They are assimilating to a culture and a way of life that sees them and their culture as lesser. A 1959 report about the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, which is several years after this program started, found that most Utah Mormons believed, quote, that by righteous living, the dark-skinned races may again become white and delightsome. So, again, is an indigenous child really doing well if they successfully assimilated into a community that believes this about them and their people and their culture? I mean, if you think that, you are white supremacist. The idea that brown-skinned indigenous people's skin will turn gradually white naturally as they begin to live righteously is just obviously so ridiculous that it can't be overstated. And so is the idea that black people will also turn white, but only when they get to heaven and only when they have their new glorious bodies. But these were the church's teachings. These were the beliefs. The vast majority of people in the church believed these things. So, back to Twilight. I've already mentioned the idea of Twilight's vampirism as an allegory for biblical salvation, plus Meyer's choice and insistence that all the vampires be a pale white. Do you see where I'm going here? In the illustrated guide, Meyer says vampire venom during transformation lightens the pigment of one's skin as a part of the transformation process. She writes, "Pale vampire skin is a product of vampire venom's transformative process. The venom leaches all pigment from the skin as it changes the human skin into more indestructible vampire form. Regardless of original ethnicity, a vampire skin will be exceptionally pale. The hue varies slightly, with darker-skinned humans having a barely discernible olive tone to their vampire skin, but the light shade remains the same. All forms of skin pigmentation, freckles, moles, birthmarks, age marks, scars, and tattoos disappear during the transformation." Talking about their skin and beauty, she says, "The common factor of beauty among vampires is mostly due to this crystalline skin. The perfect smoothness, gloss, and even color of the skin gives the illusion of a flawless face. The skin reacts differently to light, creating an angular effect that heightens the perception of beauty." This is just the most Mormon way you can physically characterize the vampire trope. Like, it cannot possibly get more Mormon than this. I found this direct quote from Mormon General Authority George P. Lee. He interpreted the church teachings on skin color to mean that everyone's skin color would be changed to a dazzling white in the celestial kingdom. A dazzling white. You remember who has dazzling white skin in the story? In direct sunlight, the display between human and vampire becomes more obvious. The cellular membrane of the vampire is not as soft or permeable as in a human cell. It has crystalline properties that cause the surface of vampire skin to react prismatically, giving the vampire a glitter-like shimmer in sunlight. You can't make this up. It literally all writes itself. So this person, George Lee, is a very interesting actor in all of this. He stated that he had seen some Native American members of the church upset over these teachings and that they did not want their skin color changed as they liked being brown. And so he generally avoided discussing this topic. But the craziest thing about George P. Lee, though, is that he was Native American. He was Navajo, in fact, the first one ever to become a general authority in the Mormon church. He was born in 1943, and as a child, he was a participant in the Indian Student Placement Program. He went on to study at BYU. And, he ended up being excommunicated from the LDS Church in 1989 for what he claimed was because of his disagreement with the church over the role of Native Americans in it. but not quite for what you might think. He was actually disagreeing with the president at the time, Ezra Taft Benson, for choosing to end the Indian student placement program. Lee claimed that the program was actually really beneficial for Native Americans as it was for him, and he thought that the church was not treating Native Americans like Kimball would have wanted. Yes, Kimball. Remember, the dude who said this. This is really heartbreaking. I mean, clearly the indoctrination ran very, very deep. So, as I've stated earlier, vampires of color don't exist in Meyer's conception. They're all strictly white, but that doesn't mean that she doesn't have any POC characters. You remember who the characters of color are exclusively characterized as? The wolves, or shapeshifters, rather. They are strictly indigenous Americans, and that's not by any coincidence. Their race is intrinsically tied to that concept, much like vampirism is tied to whiteness, except with the wolves, it's even more so because being a wolf in the world of Twilight is caused by a heritable gene passed down to some people in this particular indigenous tribe, the Quileute tribe. And yes, they're a real tribe. And wolves are actually a big part of this real tribe's legends. And no, Meyer didn't ask or get permission from anyone from the Quileute tribe to appropriate or rather misappropriate their legends and culture and traditions. And you can tell because she depicts them so ignorantly and so disrespectfully. I did quite a bit of research on the Quileutes. All the legends in the books are part of their tradition. The only legend that is not part of the Quileute tradition is the part I devised specifically to fit the Cullens. All right, Stephanie, let's see what indigenous cultural history you revised to fit the narrative of these sparkly, rich, white, racist vampires. Thankfully, we don't have to look too hard because there is an entire website called Truth vs. Twilight. It's a collaboration between the Burke Museum of Natural History and Culture and the Quileute tribe, dedicated to correcting all the misconceptions that Stephanie illustrates about the Quileute. This project was done by Dr. Diane Dart Newton and University of Washington graduate student Tasio Endo. In the intro, they write, in addition to failing to compensate the Quileute amidst the Twilight craze, Stephanie Meyer and Summit Entertainment present fictional, misappropriated views of Quileute people and culture. Treated as fictional werewolves, the Quileute people are portrayed as mythic characters in a fantasy role, rather than as human beings. First things first, Stephanie Meyer takes the creative audacity to rewrite Quileute traditions. In the world of Twilight, certain male members of the Quileute tribe possess the gene that allows them to shapeshift into wolves. The purpose of this is to serve as a means of protection for the tribe, a way they evolved to protect themselves from vampires. Now, this runs counter to real Quileute legend, obviously. The only record of wolf transformation in Quileute culture happens in the opposite. The transformer arrived at La Push, creating the first Quileute people from a pair of nearby wolves. In Stephanie's version, it is specific members of the tribe that can trace their direct bloodline back to the original man of the tribe that first transformed into a wolf, who also can do the same. But that gene is first activated in the presence of vampires only, and it's only triggered during the adolescent developmental stage. So it's only in the presence of vampires that these Quileute people can begin to start undergoing the process of transformation. And once they undergo that, they can now switch back and forth between being a human and being a wolf in a process that she calls phasing. And it's important to note that prior to the Cullens visiting Forks in the early 2000s and other vampires coming to the area as a subsequent result, there had not been any Quileute members that underwent the transformation for many, many decades. Newton and Endo compare this to altering the creation story of the Judeo-Christian world, but make it a point to say that it's an even bigger affront because that Genesis story is so widely known, it's basically common knowledge, and everyone would know that it would be a rewrite. But in the case of the Quileute origin story, it is relatively unknown, and so it's much more likely that the millions of people that have seen Twilight would believe that its depiction of shape-shifting werewolves is actually a part of tribal traditions and origins and legends. Another thing she takes the liberty to just make up is that these Quileute wolves imprint, and that's how they get a mate. Jacob says, when you see her, everything changes. It's not like love at first sight, really. It's more like gravity moves suddenly. It's not the earth holding you here anymore. She does. You become whatever she wants you to be, whether that's a protector or a lover or a friend. Throughout the series, she has several Quileute members not only imprint on people, but on children and babies, with the idea that when said children grow up, they will then probably be lovers. The most notorious example of this is, of course, Jacob imprinting on Bella and Edward's little demon child, Renesmee. It's really weird. I hate that she did that. She's really, really weird for that, but more on this point will come up later on. Meyer also makes all Quileute wolves cut their hair. She made it so that the length of their hair when they're in their human form translates directly to how long their hair is as wolves. And longer hair as a wolf is extremely impractical, so they all have to keep it very short for this reason. In the beginning of the series, Jacob has long hair, and when he undergoes his transformation in New Moon, his hair is chopped off. This is a very, very insidious concept to include in this way with Indigenous American characters, because hair in many of their cultures is seen as an extension of oneself and spirit and can represent a very strong connection one has to their cultural identity and heritage. This is why residential schools that attempted to civilize Indigenous Americans would force them to cut their hair in order to assimilate and force them to abide by white supremacist Western cultural norms. While an Indigenous person themselves can make a personal decision to do what they want with their own hair, forcing them to cut it, like Meyer requires of the wolves in the story, is a total violation of their personhood and is a part of a long-standing racist and genocidal history of erasure. In fact, rumor has it that Indigenous actor Christopher Hyatt was first set to play Jacob, but refused the role because of the requirement that he'd have to cut his hair. He actually appears very briefly in the first movie as one of Jacob's friends. Now, I wasn't able to find surefire confirmation that he was actually indeed selected for the role first, but it's what many in the fandom say, so again, it's just a rumor, but regardless, Taylor Lautner, who is not native, ended up playing him, so there's that. Anyways, as we're introduced to more pack members throughout the series, almost all of them are characterized by this overly virile and meathead behavior, as Endo and Newton put it. The rough and tumble, childish way they're always interacting with each other, sloppily guzzling down food at the dinner table, rather impolitely. Compare this to the poised Cullens in their mansion and their attire that is supposed to be coded as sophisticated, and their refined manners and their cleanliness in comparison. They often insult the Quileute wolves for smelling bad, implying that they're dirtier and beneath them in those aspects. The Quileute, in comparison, have much more modest homes than the Cullens, and this, along with the choice to always have them wear minimal clothing and lack of footwear, seems to signal that they are at the lower end of the class hierarchy. Meyer also very strongly characterizes Quileute society with a lot of messy and dysfunctional family structures. For example, Sam is characterized as having a deadbeat dad, and this is seen as a big motivator for his rise and position as an alpha male leader. And then we have Embry, whose wolf gene comes from an illicit affair that his mother, who is a member of a different tribe, had with his Quileute father, who was married to someone else, which sharply contradicts the family structure of the Cullens, who are all in forever long, stable, and committed relationships. And one could argue, well, actually, there's a lot to critique about the Cullens' relationship with each other and their family dynamic, blah, blah, blah. And I would definitely agree with you. You should have definitely gathered by now that I think the Cullens are absolutely diabolical, and I literally hate them. But the point here is that, according to Meyer, their family structure is an overall very positive one. Like, that's what the story itself tries to claim. That's what they're positioned as. Each couple is emphasized as beyond perfect for each other, and that their family is just so great. I mean, that's a major reason why Bella wants to become a part of the family so badly. The Quileute, in contrast, are not presented that way in the story. Hardly anything about their familial structures and way of life is presented in a positive way, and Bella really doesn't ever long to be a part of it, like she longs to be a part of the Cullens. Also, Newton and Endo point out that we literally never see any of these young Quileute people in school on the reservation. They only rarely ever very passively mention it. In all the movies and the books, Jacob pops up at Bella's high school to take her away and ditch, which shows that he himself is never at school. Whereas with the Cullens, obviously, we not only see them in school all the time, that's how Bella first meets them, but being educated is a major thing Meyer characterizes them with. We see the wall of graduation caps in their house that they keep as a joke for all the times they've graduated high school. But not just high school, almost all the Cullens also have several higher degrees from prominent Ivy League universities. Carlisle with medicine, who sometimes even teaches. Edward is mentioned to have 2 graduate medical degrees, actually. I don't know if most people know that. Along with various other degrees like law and business and stuff. Jasper with history and philosophy, Rosalie with engineering and astrophysics, Alice with fashion and international business, Esme with architecture and art, and Emmett never fully completing a degree path, but studying a lot of various things alongside his siblings. Now, compare all of that to the Quileute characters, who barely even physically go to high school. We just see them running around. And as for the adults, we don't even really know what any of them do occupationally, besides their presence as elders in the tribe. I mean, I think we know one of them might work for the police force or something like that. But like, we don't really know what Jacob's dad does, besides that he kind of just shows up whenever it's relevant, and that's usually for drinking and watching sports with Charlie or something, when it's not to drop some lore about the wolves in front of a campfire. Like, all these traits that Meyer characterizes so heavily with the Quileute, being poor, their lack of education, dysfunctional relationships, are obviously things that are common amongst all sorts of different groups of people. But Twilight makes them so heavily associated with Native Americans in comparison to all of the other people in the story. And we haven't even mentioned the temperament Meyer gives them. Oh my god. Like, the Quileute characters are characterized as having extreme anger issues. Meyer intentionally characterizes them in this way. In that illustrated guide, she says, if a tribe member meets both conditions for transformation, he will go through a number of physical and psychological changes. First, a male will undergo a noticeable growth spurt, affecting both height and musculature. For a female, the physical changes are much more subtle, mainly denoted by the definition of muscle rather than bulk or height. Both males and females will experience a drastic rise in body temperature, one that a typical human would be unable to survive. At the same time, he or she will begin to have dramatic mood swings and brief sudden episodes of nearly uncontrollable rage. When the transformation is very close, he or she will begin to tremble and shake during these moments of rage. After the shaking begins, the first transformation or phase can happen within seconds if the affected person does not calm himself. All the initial transformations are triggered by rage until the werewolf can learn to control his reactions. The actual act of phasing lasts only an instant. There's no gradual shift, no in-between from where the werewolf appears to be a mixture of human and animal. Because the wolf has more than 4 times the mass of the human, to an observer the change looks explosive as the human expands to the size of a wolf. This impression can be intensified if the werewolf did not have time to remove his clothes before phasing. The clothes rip apart from the pressure of the expansion, adding a tearing sound to the otherwise soundless transformation. Young werewolves are often unable to control their phasing, shifting forms whenever they feel angry. This unpredictability, combined with the massive size of the wolf form and the suddenness of the phasing process, makes werewolves dangerous to any human in proximity to them during the change. Standing too close to a young werewolf during phasing can result in unintentional injury or even death. As young werewolves gain more control over their phasing, they have time to remove clothing, prevent it from being destroyed in the shape-shifting process. Most carry a leather strap with them so they can tie their clothes to their legs before phasing. With experience, werewolves eventually master phasing and can control when they shapeshift. We first see this transformation when, out of sheer rage, Paul phases into a wolf and violently brawls with Jacob in New Moon. But even before this, earlier on in the story, before Jacob first phases and before we fully are introduced to the wolves, we see Jacob all of a sudden acting extremely out of what his character has been up until this point, getting aggressively angry at Mike Newton and threatening violence in a situation that did not warrant that kind of reaction at all. And then he abruptly just rushes away, obviously about to undergo the beginnings of his change. And then again in Eclipse, when Jacob acts in fits of rage at Bella for her choice to become a vampire, he throws things in anger and tells her he'd rather that she'd be dead. And in Breaking Dawn, when Jacob is so overcome with sheer uncontrollable rage over Bella deciding to die in order to have her offspring, we see his rage from his perspective for the first time as he's running through the woods. And it's depicted so animalistically. The voices, the seeing red. I mean, he's literally turned into a wolf, into an animal running wild. Compare these depictions of these indigenous werewolves to one of several racist depictions of indigenous peoples proposed by Protestant ministers with political aims at exploiting them. This is from Samuel Davies in a sermon to volunteers fighting in the French and Indian War. Our frontiers, ravaged by merciless savages, and our fellow subjects, there murdered with all the horrid arts of Indian and Popish torture. Sure, these are not men. They are not beasts of prey. They are something worse. They must be infernal furies in human shape. The concept of uncontrollable anger within indigenous people is a large part of an oppressive colonialist narrative. In 1990, when Mohawk nations formed a barricade to prevent encroachment from white developers in Canada, this narrative was weaponized against the indigenous peoples acting in self-defense. Although polls conducted during the standoff showed some support by non-native Canadians outside of Quebec for the Mohawk causes, most received their information about the so-called Oka crisis through the corporate media, which overwhelmingly represented the event as a law and order issue, fundamentally undermined by indigenous peoples' uncontrollable anger and resentment. And such language continues to be used in colonial projects against indigenous peoples. Consider, as one of many examples, the Israeli defense minister's description of Palestinians as human animals. The larger point here is Stephanie Meyer drew on all of these real-world racist stereotypes from history and the present to inform and create these characters in her writing and in the action and conflict of the story. Everything that characterizes the conflict in the Twilight series between the wolves and the vampires operates within the real-world historical racial framework. You absolutely cannot separate it from that, whether intended or not. And Meyer willfully pulls from it, because why would she make one group exclusively white and the other exclusively Native American, make those two things intrinsically tied to each group's fantastical characterization, them textbook historical racial stereotypes of each group, and then write a story where they are sworn enemies and clash over land disputes? Like, come on, girl, it's not subtle. When you look back at all the history of colonial struggles in the US, especially particularly as it relates to Mormonism, it's all there. White colonizers show up on lands that indigenous people were already inhabiting and believed they had some sort of right to it. They started the conflict with indigenous Americans and then somehow blamed indigenous peoples for their reaction to being colonized and systemically brutalized. You know, just like these white vampires, the Cullens, or more like the colonizers, as I like to dub them, really trigger wolf transformation in the Quileute by their presence because of how much of a threat they are to the tribe and really all of humanity. And yet, Quileutes are blamed for their response to that, for their reaction to something that is very dangerous to them. They are being blamed for being angry, and said anger is depicted as extreme and unwarranted and animalistic. Just like in real-world colonial dynamics, all of this puts indigenous people in a twisted catch-22, wherein they have no way to express their very justified anger at being constantly violated and attacked. Stephanie Meyer's portrayal of the werewolves needing to tame their dangerous and unfounded rage calls on the classic colonizer argument that they must simply learn to calm down and assimilate. This strips oppressed people of their humanity and power. As Coulthard writes, indigenous people's anger and resentment can indicate a sign of moral protest and political outrage that we ought to at least take seriously, if not embrace as a sign of our critical consciousness. Yet Twilight is written in a way where both groups' hostility and dislike for each other is in many ways seen as an equal feud where both parties need to be open and come to some sort of understanding.
I'm tired of this. From now on, I'm Switzerland.
No! Vampires obviously pose a danger to humans because humans are what they eat, right? In the world of Twilight, there have been vampires in the past that have attacked and preyed on members of the Quileute tribe in particular. And again, it's that danger that causes the shapeshifter gene in certain members of the tribe to phase. It literally functions to protect them. These colonizers just show up in Forks, Washington, which exists on Quileute land for the first time since the mid-20th century, but because they are different from other vampires in that they follow a vegetarian diet, which is only drinking the blood of animals, not humans, the Quileute agree to sign a treaty with them, where they graciously allow them to live and hunt on certain portions of their land, so long as they stay on those portions and they don't harm any humans, and they stay away from the reservation where tribe members reside so that the shape-shifting gene isn't triggered in any of them. So the colonizers leave Forks after a few years, but then return in the early 2000s, which is then when all the events of Twilight take place, knowing full well the kind of anxiety and danger that this poses to the Quileute. Their return causes Sam, a young member of the tribe, to phase, and he's the first one to do so in a very long time. And that starts a chain reaction as more young Quileute members over the course of the series start to turn. It's literally the Cullens' fault, and they know that. And they have the gall to hate the Quileute anyway, even though the Quileute literally didn't do anything. They are literally just trying to live in peace on their land. That's it. Free from any vampires around, because, again, they're a danger on every level. And the Cullens ruin that for them. They come back when they could literally go anywhere else in the world. But Stephanie Meyer writes the story with the assumption that these colonizers have some sort of right to be there, despite how dangerous and unfair it is on every level. She tries to convince us that the Cullens' hatred for the wolves is just as legitimate, and that they are reasonable for thinking that the wolves are more dangerous, and it just doesn't make any sense. They're all just entitled, audacious white people. And even worse, Meyer makes it so that the very thing that these indigenous people are forced to become just to protect themselves, to resist violent colonization, requires that they have to give up control of and debase something that is, to them, very symbolically tied to their soul and spirit, their hair. She probably didn't intentionally think about any of this step by step, but this is really what colonialism does to the colonized. Like, what an unintentionally great allegory, really. Honestly, remember all that Mormon history about race and skin color, and specifically how indigenous people's skin was expected to gradually lighten in some way if they followed the white righteous way of living? Remember that? Of course, that didn't just happen. Indigenous American skin color did not miraculously turn white just from practicing Mormonism and adopting the Western way of life and yada yada. Whether they resisted cultural genocide or assimilated, their skin did not just change. They were still native regardless. And white people, Mormons specifically in this context, still saw them as lesser and more savage and barbaric no matter what they did, because that's how racism works. It doesn't matter how you act. Whether they assimilated or not, there was still conflict, because it was their race and indigeneity. It was who they are that was the problem. All of this is what the nature of the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized is. The colonized are demonized for who they are and are blamed for their reasonable reactions to the violent, threatening, and entitled presence of the colonizers. Before continuing with more textual analysis in the story, I want to talk a little bit more about the relevant history on the specific colonizer and colonized dynamics as it pertains to the history of Mormonism. In the book, Joseph Smith and the Origins of the Book of Mormon, author David Pursuit outlines a key Mormon belief. As it is given in the Book of Mormon, the ancient Americans were descended from a relatively small number of Hebrews who traveled to the New World from Palestine shortly after 600 BC. That viewpoint further holds that these ancient Americans were divided into two groups: the Nephites, who built a great civilization, and the Lamanites, who exterminated the Nephites and who became the American Indians. Anti-indigenous American sentiment is baked into the very belief system of Mormonism, and all of its sects, in regards to LDS specifically, who were expelled from Missouri, then Illinois, until finally migrating to what would become the modern-day state of Utah under the leadership of Brigham Young. It was there that the Mormons began a complex colonialist relationship with several indigenous nations who resided there. First, they attempted to build alliances, but ultimately, as outlined by Mormon historian and attorney Marlon K. Jensen, they were stripped of their land by the settlers, often through violent skirmishes. Regardless of how one views the equities of Indian-Mormon relations in those times, the end result was that the land and cultural birthright Indians once possessed in the Great Basin were largely taken from them. It is important to acknowledge and appreciate the monumental loss this represents on the part of Utah's Indians. That loss and its 160-year aftermath are the rest of the story. There were also attempts at peaceful commingling and integration. After all, as Brigham Young had written in the Millennial Star, independent of the question of exercising humanity towards so degraded and ignorant a race of people, it was manifestly more economical and less expensive to feed and clothe than fight them. Some in the church, including the founder, entertained the idea of intermarriage with converted indigenous people as one means of removing the curse of dark skin through reproduction, with each subsequent generation becoming lighter, with the goal of eventually becoming white and delightsome. This unpublished July 17th, 1831 revelation was described 3 decades later in an 1861 letter from W. Phelps to Brigham Young, quoting Joseph Smith. "It is my will that in time ye should take unto you wives of the Lamanites and Nephites, that their posterity may become white, delightsome, and just." In the December 8, 1831 Ohio Star, Ezra Booth wrote of a revelation directing Mormon elders to marry with the natives. "You may inquire of the intelligent of the world whether they can tell why the aborigines of this country are dark, loathsome, ignorant, and sunken into the depths of degradation. When the Lord has a people, he makes covenants with them and gives unto them promises. Then, if they transgress his law, changes his ordinances, and breaks his covenants he has made with them, he will put a mark upon them, as in the case of the Lamanites and other portions of the house of Israel. But by and by they will become a white and delightsome people." It was who they were, their culture, their indigeneity, that was the problem. And that's what needed to be different or changed in some sort of way. Meyer essentially says the same thing about the Quileute wolves in Twilight. We can really see all this racism much more intimately in the character assassination that is Jacob Black. What was once a sweet, kind, and funny boy became a very bitter, angry, and straight-up abusive person. Now, he absolutely has a right to be angry and bitter about the Cullens, but the way that Meyer has him express that anger is just awful. One shining example is he literally assaults Bella. And by depicting his anger and rage like this, Meyer delegitimizes it and makes Edward's prejudice and racism against Jacob look justified. Instead of writing Jacob's arc as him being the same nice and genuinely kind-hearted character who now simply just struggles to navigate legitimate anger, he just becomes that anger. It fully consumes him. It's a very racist way to write a person of color and their reaction to oppression. Then, in Breaking Dawn, he's even further objectified by being used in a gross plot device to put the conflict between the vampires and the wolves to rest. So if we can recall, in Breaking Dawn, the Cullens continue not to care about the wolves at all. They continue on with this colonial entitlement they have, and in order to save themselves, bring even more vampires, bring even more of their vampire friends around to Forks to bear witness to their innocence of a crime that they're accused of committing against vampire law. This causes even more Quileute members to transform than ever before, but this time, really, really young members, like preteen children. And the Cullens don't care. The wolves agree to eventually just accept and endure that unfair suffering and help them because Stephanie Meyer chooses to put the conflict to rest and appease the Quileute by eternally bonding these two groups together forever through intermarriage. Jacob imprints on Edward and Bella's baby. They will eventually get together as partners when she grows up. And that's how the Cullen v. Quileute conflict is ended. The Native American marries the white Mormon and fully assimilates forever. Describing the moment Jacob imprints on Rasputin, Stephanie writes, "Everything that made me who I was, my love for the dead girl upstairs, my love for my father, my loyalty to my new pack, the love for my other brothers, my hatred for my enemies, my home, my name, myself, disconnected from me in that second, snip, 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 and floated up into space. The gravity of the earth no longer tied me to the place where I stood. It was the baby girl in the blonde vampire's arms that held me here now. Renesmee." His pack, his family, his tribe, none of that matters to him anymore. Now that he can be joined into this relationship with this little demon baby. After this moment, again, Jacob's character completely changes. He essentially becomes a little subservient, abused house slave. The physical pain he is subjected to by this little baby Ragnarok biting him and drawing blood all the time is justified because as a wolf he heals so quickly, so it's no big deal. I can't help but feel that this is connected to the age-old myth that people of color feel less pain in order to justify abuses done to them. The racially motivated insults and jibes that the Cullens may throw his way also don't matter because he doesn't care anymore. He only cares for little Rip Van Winkle and puts up with all of it and submits to her. Because it is against pack law to hurt or kill the person a wolf imprints on, the pack is then left with no choice but to make permanent peace with the Cullens. And within all this framework, Stephenie Meyer puts the cherry on top by having this exclusively white group continuously use historically racist terms and rhetoric against the indigenous group, such as dog, mutt, and mongrel. Rosalie, one of the vampires, goes as far as to serve Jacob out of a dog bowl. And he's in his human form, mind you. But because they are these shape-shifting wolves, the reader is encouraged to overlook it and just accept that this is a vampire versus wolf thing and not a race thing. I do not think we can separate this from historical racial connotations. There's no way. Over the years, fans of Twilight, as they have grown up, have started to acknowledge its severe racism issues. I would say that the average Twilight fan would admit that the series is racist, at least in part, hopefully. But I don't think most of them understand just how deep the racism is. It's almost kind of unbelievable how great an allegory for colonialism and its effects on indigenous peoples and peoples of color this series is. And I know the fans don't understand this enough because of how big and accepted being Team Edward and unironically loving the Cullens still is. Because of how mainstream disliking Jacob is without any real acknowledgement of the racist nature behind the decimation of his character. And lastly, because of how widespread the point of defending Twilight against so-called misogynistic attacks still is, it's just... you don't need to defend it. You really don't, especially for that, considering that the character that gets mistreated and screwed over the most is Leah, an indigenous woman. And by screwed over, I don't just mean her character suffers unfortunate events in the story. I mean Stephenie Meyer literally hates her. She writes her with such contempt to the point where it makes the reader wonder what even is the point of this character besides being a punching bag for everyone. I mean, it really seems like Stephenie uses Leah to unload her own misogyny and disdain and racism all wrapped up into one, and it's honestly very, very cruel and hard to read. Indigenous creator Ali Nahdee brilliantly unpacks all the issues surrounding Meyer's creation and handling of Leah's character specifically, and gives insight into the really egregious ways this franchise depicts indigenous womanhood better than I ever could, so please check out this video. I say all this not to say that you can't ever watch Twilight or take any pleasure from reading the books, although if you do, don't buy them or stream them directly, buy them secondhand or use other means. But what I'm saying is there needs to be much more mindfulness with the way in which we engage with this franchise. We can't continue to engage with it and its characters so flippantly in our fan pages and comment sections and Reddit threads, just accepting this narrative that Meyer wants us to accept, that the Cullens and Edward and Bella are the heroes to be rooting for, and that the vampires and the wolves can and should just reconcile and make peace and become besties. When we watch Twilight, the enjoyment we get from it should not involve conceding to these ideas for the sake of the story. Instead, it should stem from being hypercritical of them, from pushing back on them because, one, the latter is a lot more fun and actually subversive, and two, most importantly, said fun doesn't come at the expense and alienation of marginalized peoples. Rather, it gives them the stage.